There are lies people tell in panic. And then there are lies people plan. What my family did to me wasn't an emotional mistake or a misunderstanding born out of grief. It was deliberate, calculated, quietly executed while I was still trying to understand how life had changed after my father died. Everyone says loss brings families closer, but in my case, it revealed something darker. While I was mourning, they were organizing. While I was struggling to breathe through the silence he left behind, they were writing a story where I was the problem that needed to be managed. At first, it sounded harmless. They told people I wasn't coping well. That grief had affected my judgment. They said it with concern in their voices, the kind that makes others nod sympathetically, instead of asking questions. They told friends they were keeping an eye on me, told relatives they were just trying to help. And slowly, the way people looked at me changed. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Decisions were made without including me. My reactions were no longer seen as human responses to loss, but symptoms of something broken. Then came the paperwork. Documents I had never seen before. Evaluations I had never agreed to. Reports written in clinical language that stripped me of my voice and reduced me to a list of behaviors and assumptions. They said I was unstable, that I couldn't be trusted with finances, that I needed supervision. And because it was written down, because it looked official, people believed it. No one asked me what I felt. No one asked me what was true. They played their roles perfectly. In public, they were calm, exhausted, selfless. They spoke about how hard it was to care for someone like me, how much they had sacrificed. Donations started coming in. Sympathy messages flooded their phones. They were praised for their strength, their patience, their kindness. And I was quietly erased. Friends stopped calling. Relatives avoided eye contact. I learned very quickly that anything I said could be used against me. If I protested, it proved I was unstable. If I stayed quiet, it proved I was dependent. There was no version of me that could win inside the story they had built. So I stopped fighting. Not because I believed them, but because I understood something important. They were watching my reactions, not my truth. Every emotional response fed their narrative. So I became still. I listened. I observed. I paid attention to what they said when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I noticed inconsistencies, small slips, moments when the mask cracked. I saved messages. I noted dates. I remembered words. Silence became my shield. What they never realized was that their confidence made them careless. They laughed when they thought no one was listening. They joked about how easy it was to control the situation, about how people would believe anything if it came wrapped in concern. And one night, by accident, I found it. A recording they thought was gone. A moment they never expected to be heard again. Their voices were relaxed, amused, unguarded. They weren't talking about helping me. They were talking about managing me. About how convincing the act had been. About how no one would ever believe me anyway. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I felt angry, but because I felt clear. I finally understood that I hadn't imagined anything. I hadn't been weak. I hadn't been broken. I had been framed, carefully, patiently, by the very people who stood beside me and called themselves my protectors. And for the first time since my father's death, I didn't feel lost. I felt focused. I'm not telling this story for sympathy. I'm telling it because silence protected them for too long. Because stories like this only work when the truth stays quiet. I stayed silent once to survive. I won't stay silent again. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of the part they never planned for. The part where I speak. And the truth speaks with me. By the time I found the recording, I had already learned how invisible I was supposed to be. They didn't hide things from me anymore. Because they no longer saw me as a threat. I was the quiet one, the fragile one, the person whose words didn't carry weight. That false confidence was their biggest mistake. The recording wasn't hidden behind passwords or locks. It was left behind in the kind of carelessness that comes when people believe they've already won. When I pressed play, I wasn't even expecting anything significant. I was just curious. Then I heard their voices, relaxed and unfiltered, speaking about me like I wasn't human, like I was a problem they had solved, rather than a person they had destroyed. They laughed. Not nervously, not in discomfort, but casually, the way people laugh when they're proud of themselves. They talked about how easy it had been to convince others, how once the label was placed on me, everything I did only made it stronger. One of them joked that I played the role perfectly without even realizing it. Another said people preferred a clean story, with a broken person more than a complicated truth. Sitting there alone, listening to them rewrite my life as entertainment, I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt something colder and steadier take its place. I didn't confront them. I didn't react. I understood that the moment I let them know I had heard the truth, they would destroy what little evidence I had. So I went back to being exactly who they expected me to be. Quiet. Agreeable. Invisible. But this time, every interaction had a purpose. I started documenting everything, saving copies, backing them up, checking dates and statements. I compared their public words to their private actions. The gaps were everywhere once I knew where to look. What shocked me most wasn't how much they lied, but how confident they were that no one would ever challenge them. They spoke freely around lawyers, doctors, and family friends, knowing the image they had built protected them. They knew the label they placed on me was stronger than any denial I could make. If I accused them, I would only be proving their point. So instead, I let them talk. I let them underestimate me. I let them believe the story was finished. The turning point came when I realized I didn't need people to believe me immediately. I just needed proof that couldn't be explained away. Truth doesn't need volume when it has weight. The recording was just the beginning. It led me to old messages, financial trails, and small administrative decisions that all pointed in the same direction. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together, they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. A pattern of control disguised as care. For the first time, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. I stopped thinking like someone trapped inside their story, and started thinking like someone preparing to end it. I knew exposure wouldn't come from anger or confrontation. It would come from timing, from letting them step into a moment where their own words would speak louder than mine ever could. They still think I'm silent because I'm broken. They still think this ends the way they wrote it. What they don't understand is that silence was never surrender. It was preparation. And the next time they hear my name, it won't be in whispers or pity. It will be in questions they can't answer and truths they can't erase. They never noticed when the balance shifted. Because people who believe they are untouchable stop paying attention to the ground beneath their feet. By the time everything was ready, they were still performing the same role they had rehearsed for months: calm, concerned, admired. Invitations kept arriving. Panels, charity events, quiet praise for how bravely they had handled someone like me. I stood beside them in public, silent and small, exactly as the story required, while carrying something they never imagined I had: the truth, intact and waiting. I didn't choose a private confrontation. I chose a moment where silence wouldn't protect them anymore. A room full of witnesses does something powerful to the truth. When the event began, it was polished and predictable, filled with speeches about resilience and sacrifice. They spoke about me without saying my name, describing the burden of caring for someone fragile, the strength it took to make difficult decisions. People applauded. Cameras recorded everything. And then, for the first time, the story paused. When the recording played, there was no dramatic announcement. No anger, just sound. Their voices, unmistakable and relaxed, laughing about how easy it had been to control the narrative. How once the label was placed on me, no one would ever listen to me again. The room didn't react all at once. Confusion came first. Then recognition, then a quiet, collective understanding that something irreversible had just happened. You can argue with accusations, but you can't argue with your own voice. They tried to speak. They tried to explain. But explanations collapse when truth arrives fully formed. The same people who once looked at me with pity, now looked at them with doubt. Phones were raised. Messages were sent. The story began to move without them, faster than they could control. In that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt released. The weight I had carried wasn't replaced by anger, but by certainty. I no longer needed to convince anyone of who I was. The proof had already done it for me. What followed wasn't dramatic justice or instant resolution. It was quieter than that. Questions replaced praise. Support faded into distance. Doors that once opened easily began to close. The story they built didn't explode, it unraveled. And unraveling is worse, because it leaves nowhere to hide. For the first time, they were the ones being explained, analyzed, doubted. I walked away without saying anything else. Not because I was afraid, but because the truth no longer needed my voice to survive. I had spent months being defined by their version of me. Now they would spend years living inside the version of themselves they had accidentally revealed. Silence returned, but this time it belonged to them. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about patience. About understanding that power doesn't always come from speaking louder, but from waiting until the truth can speak for itself. They thought they ended me by calling me unstable. What they actually did was give me time. And time, used correctly, changes everything. After everything came out, life didn't suddenly become easy or loud or dramatic. It became quiet in a different way. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the air finally feels clean. People didn't rush to apologize. Some disappeared completely. Others avoided my eyes, unsure of what to say now that the story they believed had collapsed. I didn't chase explanations or validation anymore. I didn't need it. The truth had already done what I couldn't do for months. It had placed the weight exactly where it belonged. What surprised me most was how light I felt once I stopped carrying a version of myself that was never real. I wasn't trying to prove I was strong anymore. I wasn't trying to look healed or convincing. I was just myself again, without defending my existence. The label they used to control me no longer followed me into rooms. Conversations felt normal. Choices were mine. For the first time since my father's death, I wasn't being watched through suspicion or pity. I was simply being seen. They never faced the ending they expected for me. There was no collapse, no breakdown, no dramatic confirmation of their lies. Instead, there was something far more uncomfortable for them. My stability. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was indifference. I didn't need revenge to move forward, because the truth had already rearranged the power. The roles had reversed without me lifting my voice. And that was enough. I rebuilt slowly, carefully, without announcing it to anyone. New routines. New boundaries. A life that didn't require permission. I learned that healing isn't about erasing what happened, but about no longer living inside it. What they tried to turn into my identity became a chapter I could close on my own terms. Not forgotten, but no longer controlling the story. I'm telling this now not because I want to relive it, but because stories like mine survive in silence. They depend on people believing that the truth, will never be worth the cost of speaking. Sometimes it isn't about fighting back immediately. Sometimes survival looks like patience, observation, and waiting until the truth can no longer be denied. Silence can be a weapon, if you're the one holding it. This is where my story ends, not with anger, not with applause, but with clarity. I was never unstable. I was never broken. I was underestimated. And I walked away with something they never thought I'd have, my life, fully mine again.